Seattle is in the grips of the biggest population boom in our history. Population in the city is growing faster than ever before. And in fact, I think 18,000 newcomers into the city of Seattle last year. We're also in a giant construction boom. I don't know if you've noticed that. More cranes over the city of Seattle than any other American city right now. And despite the phenomenal pace of construction, we still have fast rising prices and rents for homes. This is a crisis or a housing shortage that touches all of us. Many of you may have seen on the way in the photos we have of the Seattle Neighbors Project, and some of you, I think, participated in the photo booth to add your stories. All of us have a story about this housing shortage and the rising and escalating prices in our city, and it's become, as you well know, a top political issue. So we spend a lot of time in Seattle talking about Seattle and its housing issues. Tonight we're going to hear about other places which are struggling with housing affordability, and then we'll talk about what are the lessons of these other places for Seattle. We're going to hear from two of my favorite thinkers and writers about this subject. First, from Daniel K. Hertz, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. He has been writing about this, about housing and neighborhood change, urban demographics, public transit, and other crux issues for a number of years. A lot of highly influential pieces published in City Observatory, the Washington Post, and a bunch of other places. He's going to talk to us tonight about the lessons of his home city of Chicago. And then we'll hear from Kim-Mai Cutler, a third-generation resident of the San Francisco Bay Area. In fact, she told me that she's lived in every part of the Bay Area except for Marin. That's right. It's funny. She's a 10-year veteran journalist, mostly in business. She's written for TechCrunch, for Bloomberg, for the Wall Street Journal. In 2014, the housing conundrum of the Bay Area reached out and grabbed her, and she started writing about housing in addition to her business journalism. And she did an article called How Burrowing Owls Led to Vomiting Anarchists. Put your hand up if you read that article, right? A fair number of us have read the article. It made a big impact on me. And that article helped to launch the Bay Area YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement. And she's done a number of other pieces. She's currently working at an early stage venture capital firm in the Bay Area called Initialized Capital. And she's going to talk about the stories and the lessons from the Bay Area for us in Seattle. So first, let me set the stage by talking a little bit about the housing market and some other places. Housing market is like a giant game of musical chairs, a game of musical chairs that spreads across an entire metropolitan area. When we were kids, you had to be fast to get a chair. Otherwise, you'd end up on the ground, right? But in the housing market, you don't have to be fast. You just have to be rich. That's why I call it cruel musical chairs. When there aren't enough chairs, people with money always win, and people without money always lose. I don't mean this in some kind of metaphorical sense. I mean, I literally mean that the housing market is just like a game of musical chairs, except with money. And the dynamics are the same whether you're talking about 10 kids with chairs or 3 million adults, as we have in the greater Seattle area, playing. You need a chair for every person. You need one dwelling for every household. Without enough dwellings, people will bid up the price of whatever dwellings there are. Prices will soar, and those at the bottom end of the market will end up excluded. So the only way to stop the rise of prices and of rents and to stop displacing those at the bottom of the market is to provide enough chairs. We need more homes, all shapes, all sizes, for all the people who want to be our neighbors. So cruel musical chairs shows itself in many ways. It shows up in the terrible tragedies of displacement that we see in our communities. It also shows up in the data. Average home prices and rents per square foot are shown on this chart. Home prices on the top, rents on the bottom. This is per square foot, so adjusted to reflect the size of the units. On the bottom, on the rental prices, it's for one-bedroom apartments. Again, normalized so that we can compare between metropolitan areas. And there are 4 major metropolitan areas on the chart. The three on the right are the focus of our conversation tonight. San Francisco, as you can see on the upper half of the chart for home price, the home price per square foot is more than twice as high in greater San Francisco than in greater Seattle. You can see that Chicago is just a little more than half of Seattle. Daniel and Kim are going to talk about those cases. I want to start by talking about the one on the left, Houston, the city that urban planning snobs like us in Seattle like to hate. You can see that home prices in Houston per square foot are about 1/3 of the price in Seattle. Now, when I talk about Houston, we're probably all going to think about the hurricane first. So I'm going to talk about Houston before the hurricane, though the future of Houston may be much the same. Houston is maybe the most pro-housing city in the United States. Before the hurricane, housing cost less, adjusted for inflation, not only than Seattle or Chicago or San Francisco, but then it did in Houston in 1980. Right? In Seattle, the price of housing has what? Quintupled, sextupled. In Houston, the price per square foot, adjusted for inflation, has stayed the same or, in fact, declined slightly since 1980. The median price of a single-family house in the county that surrounds Houston is $141,000 in July, a month before the hurricane. In King County, that surrounds Seattle, smaller population, which should result in a lower house price, median home price is $658,000, more than 4.5 times. It's the same housing, the same drywall, the same studs, the same conduit and piping and all the rest. And furthermore, Houston is not some Rust Belt city of decay and outmigration. It's not Detroit. It's not old housing stock that has been abandoned as the population diminished. Houston is the 4th largest city in the United States. It's among the fastest growing cities in the United States, even with the hurricane. And because of the phenomenal pace of investment and construction in Houston, I think actually that it's going to bounce back from this Armageddon storm that just struck it, maybe more thoroughly and quickly than, for example, New Orleans did. Houston is interesting in another way. It's the most diverse, large metropolitan area in the country. It's kind of a demographic forerunner of the United States overall. There is no majority demographic, only a set of minority demographics in Houston. And how is Houston so affordable? Well, Houston has enabled housing construction on a massive scale. Very little red tape, very little delay. No conventional zoning in the city of Houston, though there is conventional zoning in the suburban jurisdictions. Now, it does have various constraints on construction of residential buildings, but compared with other North American cities, it's just much more welcoming to home building. Now, many of you are already thinking, but it's Houston. The way that it's done this is just to sprawl. And that's right. Greater Houston has sprawled like few other places in the world. Greater Houston now covers an area the size of the state of Massachusetts. So the question from Houston, though, is real for us. It's not whether you can stop the game of cruel musical chairs by building enough homes for everyone who wants to live there. They answered the question, and the answer is yes. The question is whether you can do that without sprawling. That's the question from Houston. And the answer is yes. Consider Tokyo. Largest city on the planet, metro area population of 38 million. It's one of the world's densest, most transit-oriented, lowest carbon urban agglomerations anywhere. And despite what you may have heard, housing in Tokyo is actually a bargain. Certainly there are exceptions, especially close to the center of the city, but you can get a detached single-family home in a close-in part of Tokyo for $300,000, less than half the price in the city of Seattle. In fact, over the past decade, as in Houston, rent has actually decreased because construction of additional housing has actually outpaced population growth. You may be thinking that Tokyo's population is declining. It's not. Japan's has stabilized or begun to decline, but Tokyo is continuing to grow. The reason for Tokyo's affordability? It's the same as in Houston. Home construction is extremely easy. There are very few legal barriers, few delays, little red tape. And consequently, there's an enormous amount of home construction in Tokyo. Tokyo proper, not the entire metropolitan area, the Tokyo proper is about 13 million people. The most recent year for which I was able to get data show that builders started 142,000 homes inside the city of Tokyo in 2014. Compare that to the state of California. California has 3 times as many people, and it started in the same year 84,000 new homes. 3 times the people, a little more than half as many new homes being built. Now, Tokyo is an extreme case, but it's not alone. Oh, I'm one slide behind. Consider Vienna, another model. There in the 1920s, a left-wing government began erecting vast new housing blocks in complexes designed by award-winning architects and admired by urbanists to this day. Probably this picture, for many of you, looks more inviting than some of the Tokyo pictures that I put up. This pattern of construction plus generation after generation of expansion of it, both in public housing and in production of housing by nonprofit organizations and by housing associations, low-profit organizations, unlike any that we have here. This housing now accommodates some 62% of Greater Vienna's population in units like that. Compared with Seattle or San Francisco or, in fact, Chicago, Vienna builds a lot of housing, much more housing. And compared to Seattle, at least, it builds much denser housing. The city of Vienna is mostly apartment buildings. There is not a single acre of single-family zoning in all of Vienna. It's like the polar opposite of Seattle. Parks and open space cover half the city in Vienna, half the city, and yet overall much higher density and much more affordable housing. They successfully, in this case through public and nonprofit construction, stopped the game of cruel musical chairs by providing homes for all who want to live there. One more example, closer to home. Not that close to home, but closer to home, Canada's second most populous metropolitan area. Now, we've all probably heard about the horror stories from Vancouver, BC, about how super expensive it is, even worse than Seattle. Well, Montreal has typical housing costs that are less than half as much as in Vancouver, BC, and proportionally, similarly, than Seattle. Because again, Greater Montreal keeps building residences, lots of them. It's added more homes over the last decade than Greater Vancouver, than San Francisco, than Greater Seattle. They're putting out enough chairs for everyone who's playing the game of cruel musical chairs. What's interesting to me about Montreal is that much of the metropolitan area is zoned for low-rise flats and for some mid-rise apartment buildings. Zoning is sort of the inverse of Seattle's. We give most land to detached single-family houses, then we concentrate apartment buildings in high-rise and mid-rise pockets or along arterials. Montreal gives most of the land to low-rise and mid-rise apartments. There's very little land for detached single-family houses. There's also very little land for high-rise construction, which is the most expensive type of housing to build. Whereas the 3-story walk-ups and flats that dominate Montreal's geography by the square mile, this is the most affordable housing to build and to operate. The pattern is not just in the city, but the suburbs have extended the same pattern, and overall metropolitan Montreal is, this may be surprising, it's the second densest city in Canada. It's a little bit less dense than Toronto, but just by a whisker, and it's actually much denser than Greater Vancouver, even though we think of Vancouver as super dense because of the skinny towers that we're used to seeing when we go to the center of Vancouver. But overall, because Montreal is almost all what we call missing middle housing, it is denser than Vancouver and dramatically denser than Seattle. And it's affordable. So there are a few models that are available to us to draw lessons from, though none of them could be replicated wholesale here. All different models and approaches and ideas for how we can end the game of cruel musical chairs. As I've been saying, the key is to build more housing, all shapes, all sizes, for all the people who want to be our neighbors. Now, having set the stage in that way, let's welcome our guests to talk about the lessons from their cities. We will start with Chicago from Daniel, and then we'll move to the Bay Area from Kim. Thank you.
See if I can, there we go. All right, hello everybody. I want to first of all thank Sightline for having me here, and thank you all for coming out. I particularly want to thank everybody for giving me the opportunity to make a presentation called Lessons from Chicago, because not very many people are asking for lessons from Chicago about basically anything at the moment, so this is a nice little like civic ego boost. Okay, so to get right into it. So we've already sort of seen this, but I just wanted to sort of hit this home. Chicago is really dramatically cheaper than basically all of the major West Coast metropolitan areas. And sort of the takeaway from this chart in particular is that that difference is really not explained by differences in income, right? So here we have Seattle, San Francisco, LA, and Portland on the bottom, and each of these are the differences. With Chicago, the blue is the difference in median household income, and the red is the difference in the median housing cost. So you can see Seattle is a wealthier metro area than Chicago. It's about 20% higher median household income, but median housing costs are somewhere around 60% higher, right? So significantly, significantly higher. Ditto San Francisco, you're looking maybe 40% higher income, but housing is well north of 200% higher. And actually, if you go down the coast, if you go down to LA, LA actually has slightly lower incomes than Chicago, and yet dramatically higher housing costs. Now this forum obviously is mostly about policy and sort of policy levers we can use to influence these numbers. But I would be remiss if I didn't sort of make a couple of sort of caveats about some of two sort of fundamentals that greatly shape this this environment in Chicago. And one of them you can see in this this map. Chicago does not have the kind of geographic barriers to expansion that a place like Seattle or San Francisco does. In that way, it's more like Houston, right? For a long time, you know, you can see we have on one side Lake Michigan, but basically in every other direction, you have buildable land as far as the eye can see. And historically, you know, the metro area has taken advantage of that to add housing to the region. You know, if you needed cheap land to add more housing, you just went to the next farm or the next prairie and you built it there. So that's important to acknowledge. Another thing that's different about Chicago regionally is there really is not anything like Amazon or Apple or Google. There isn't this sort of like giant employment boom in the region. In fact, and this is showing total employment in the Chicago metro area since 1990. You can see the 90s were pretty good for us, and since then we have basically flatlined. We just recently surpassed our employment high from 2000, before the 2001 recession, let alone the 2008 one. And so that sort of like sudden burst of new people playing musical chairs is not quite the same. Okay, so having said that, why should I continue to speak? Why is Chicago relevant at all? Well, there's the cliche tale of two cities is often applied to Chicago. And normally I would sort of, you know, object and say, well, actually that misses a lot of sort of complications and blah, blah, blah. In this case, I think it actually is sort of a useful frame for understanding why Chicago is relevant to this conversation at all. So this map on the left here was made by a guy named Pete Saunders, who is a planner and a writer in the Chicago area. And what he's colored, let's see if I can do the, yes. Okay, what he's colored in the sort of green area is what he calls super global Chicago. Basically, it is the city within the city. It's about 800,000 people. That looks a lot like sort of high income, high cost coastal cities. Incomes are much higher, it's dense and very built up, and it is seeing a pretty rapid influx of high income households moving into this area and sort of competing with other households to find housing. Those people are not coming, that's not caused by growth in the total metro area household population. It's caused by rearranging within the metro area. So, people, high income professional households who in 1990 would have located in the suburbs or in sort of outlying neighborhoods are increasingly moving to this green area. And then I also just sort of included in here another sort of data point that looks like an expensive coastal city. We have things downtown. I just got this from Curbed. A $10 million listing on the 85th floor of a 1,000-foot skyscraper being built with foreign capital, right? So it's sort of things that sort of look like these high-cost coastal cities. This I'm actually going to come back to at the end. However, one thing that doesn't look like a lot of expensive coastal cities is Chicago's downtown, and here we're really talking about the core of that wealthy core, builds housing at an extremely fast clip. So in the 2000s, between 2000 and 2010, Chicago's downtown area added about the total housing stock grew by about 50%, or 40,000 units. And this is in, a few square miles in the downtown area. It was actually the fastest growing downtown in the country in terms of population, largely because of this sort of extremely fast growth. And you can see, so this side is total housing. This side is actually just rentals in the downtown area. And you can see there was a sort of brief lull in sort of the aftermath of the 2008 recession, but really we have kicked right back into gear and are adding, 4,000, 4,500 units. Again, this is just rentals in the downtown market. And I would argue, partly as a result of that, Chicago's downtown housing prices are, now I'm not gonna tell you that $2,200 a month is like super affordable for everybody, but it is remarkably moderate given that this is sort of the top of the market in the very, very core of the city. So this is the median cost of a 2-bedroom apartment in the South Loop and Capitol Hill in Seattle. And for those of you who don't know Chicago, the South Loop is a neighborhood within walking distance of the second biggest job center in North America, right on Lake Michigan, on Grant Park, next to all the museums. And even more remarkably, because very few people lived in the South Loop, say 20 years ago, or certainly 30 years ago, something like 80% of the housing units in the South Loop are luxury high-rise units that have been built in the last 10 to 15 years, right? What you would expect to be the most expensive housing in the area. And it is, again, relatively moderate. And so what this shows is not necessarily that it's produced affordability all the way down the scale. It certainly has not, but it has sort of stopped the crisis from going up the ladder any further. And in fact, maybe one of the most remarkable things about this is that the prices are not growing. In the last year, the rents actually grew slower than inflation. In fact, in the owner-occupied market, prices are nearly flat since 2000. So we're not seeing this sort of like really, really rapid growth in prices. Okay, but there is another side to Chicago, we may build a ton downtown, but it turns out that in the neighborhoods, there's a completely different system. In the neighborhoods, local aldermen almost entirely control the development process, and they tend to be very anti-development. So this map here, over here on the left, shows, here's the loop in downtown. You'll see as you get up on the north lakefront, you see all of this yellow. All of these yellow areas are areas that actually lost housing between 2000 and 2010. And these are neighborhoods that lost housing as median incomes skyrocketed, housing costs skyrocketed. They are more desirable neighborhoods to live in than they ever have been, and yet they're losing housing units. How is that possible? Well, it's very difficult in these neighborhoods to build mid-rise, dense housing. It's difficult even in many places to build the sort of 2-3 flat buildings that are sort of Chicago's mid-density bread and butter. At the same time, there's a burgeoning market in very high-end single-family homes. And so what has happened increasingly is that people will buy a building, usually a 2 or 3 unit building, and either do a gut rehab and turn it into a single-family home, or do a tear down and just build a brand new single-family home in its place. So this is one of those. This was built as a 4-unit apartment building in the 1880s, and is currently a single-family home. Not only obviously is this unit much more expensive than any of these 4 individual units were, but it's taken 4 rental units off of the market and 3 net. And that has happened to such an extent that in many of these neighborhoods, and this is a large area, you are seeing an absolute decline in housing supply. And as a result, many of these neighborhoods, which have much older housing stock, are several miles from downtown as opposed to right in it, are even further inland off the lake, are in fact more expensive than the downtown luxury high-rises that have been built more recently. And as sort of the number of people competing for this sort of inner area increases, and the housing does not or decreases, and I'll come back to this one, people have been forced to look in further and further out neighborhoods. So these maps show essentially median income. Green is more wealthy areas, red is lower income areas. And you can see between 1970 and 2012, this sort of like, sort of gentrified, wealthy core has just exploded to take over much of the north side. And in its wake created really severe displacement crises in a lot of these neighborhoods. And I think I am getting close to my time, so I'll end with this one. So I feel a little bit odd coming and telling everybody that Chicago's housing model is something to be sort of emulated. Although I think, again, the downtown area really does have something to show. I think what we can see in Chicago is that by building so much housing, you really do at least slow the growth of costs, right? And you prevent the crisis from sort of reaching further up into the middle, into the upper middle class in the way that you really see in Seattle and San Francisco. But I added this map at the end because, so this is a map of the percentage of people who are housing burdened. As the red gets darker, it means a higher percentage of people are housing burdened. And you can see that the highest percentage of people who are housing burdened are on the south and west sides of the city. These are, in fact, by far the lowest housing cost neighborhoods. In many of these places, you can find a single family home for $100,000 or less. And I think, for me, one of the lessons here is, as I said, the first part, building more sort of assuages the crisis from reaching up into the middle and upper middle classes. For the very low income, even the sort of drastic crises of disinvestment, of segregation that have pushed these housing prices on the south and west sides down to like truly Rust Belt levels, have not been enough, right? And that really for the very lowest, we need what we've seen in what we saw in Vienna, we saw in other places, the sort of, until wages increase, we're going to need extra help for those people. And then, for time's sake, I will skip past that. Maybe we can talk about it in questions. Give it to Kim.
So I actually don't really know why I titled this A Tale of Two Cities, because you also said it was a cliche about Chicago, because this is actually my first time in Seattle, so I actually don't know anything about Seattle. So if you want to come and educate me afterwards about what you love about your city, what you hate about your city, how you wish it worked, etc., please tell me afterwards. So this presentation is mostly going to be about the Bay Area and the dystopia that is the Bay Area. So I didn't use a Charles Dickens quote. I used a Tolstoy quote instead, which is, let's just say all happy cities are alike and each unhappy city is unhappy in its own way. So I'm third generation of the Bay Area. The way I kind of got involved in this, I wasn't paying attention to urban planning or housing really that much until about 3 years ago. And the reason that I care about it is that the Bay Area has been a place of just incredible opportunity for so many people that I know, and for my family in particular. My mom was a refugee from the Vietnam War, and she first read about Silicon Valley in a business newspaper when she was a student in Australia in the late 70s. And she was disconnected from the rest of the family who were resettled in the Midwest. But one morning, she read a story about this place on the West Coast, which had all of these jobs and all these economic opportunities and all these companies. And so when she was finally reunited after 5 years, with the rest of the family, she convinced my grandfather to take a Greyhound bus with her all the way to the West Coast, and then she checked out the Bay Area, and she convinced the rest of the family that they had to go ASAP. And so, I know today in 2017 parlance, we talk about unicorns as billion-dollar privately held tech companies, but in many ways, I like to think that my mom's side of the family were real unicorns. My mom and her 5 sisters, who were all refugees, in the early 80s in the Bay Area, were able to buy a house together collectively for them and my grandparents, and they were able to do that as people in their early 20s, which is just not possible today. And today, it affects literally every single level of our job and labor market. It affects everyone. I have friends that I grew up with who want to move back. I have a really good junior high school friend who is finishing a PhD in cancer biology, and her partner is a resident, and I'm the only way you're going to come back here is probably, and if you want to have kids, is you're probably going to have to move back in with your parents. And then, last week I was on a BART stop, and I ended up talking to an elderly couple, and it became apparent after, 5-10 minutes of talking to them that they had just lost their housing and they were homeless, and that had never happened to them before in their lives. So, it's profound, it's significant. So we're going to talk about similarities and differences between our areas. So things that are similar, both Seattle and the Bay Area have the 5 most valuable companies in the world. They're enormous, they're profound, their revenue per employee ranges anywhere from the high hundreds of thousands of dollars to well over $2 million in revenue per employee, and that's Apple. We also have widening income inequality. I know that the Bay Area is well known for having lots of $100,000 plus jobs, but if you actually look at our makeup, we actually have many more very low income jobs than we have these $100,000 plus jobs, and most people don't think about that. Our geography is similar. We're both waterlocked areas. We have limited flat land to build upon, and our flat lands were filled out by the 70s, and so in order to unlock significant amounts of more housing, we have to redevelop land that is already developed upon already. The other thing is, with our geography, our big, truly large companies are suburban companies. So there has been a move in the last 5 years for companies to move into San Francisco, but these are kind of the younger companies, and they tend to be valued at around Uber is supposedly valued at, I don't know what Uber is valued at anymore, but there's Airbnb and Salesforce and Uber up in the city. They're generally either not public or they're not profitable, or probably both. And then in the South Bay, you have the truly large companies that are your Facebook, Apple, and Google that are worth $500, $700, $800 billion and pull in tens of billions of dollars a year in net income. So the really, really big companies are in the South Bay, and they're suburban, and they're older. And then here's a picture of Apple's campus. It was a $5 billion campus that just opened this year for 14,000 workers in Cupertino. They love to talk about the environmentally sound design, but what they don't show you is the 11,000 parking spots that are associated with the campus. Another similarity, I couldn't find apples to apples statistics here, but we're also generally a kind of post-automobile like designed metropolitan region. Most of the west side are single-family homes in San Francisco, and most of the Bay Area are automobile-centric, suburban sprawl, types of design and form. So there's some significant differences, and I want to walk through a lot of those. Seattle is somehow able to build twice the amount of housing per year, or roughly that of what we're able to do. As much as you guys complain about not building, we were only able to build 1 home for every 8 jobs created in the high part of the boom from 2011 to 2015. And the kind of most culpable areas were actually the suburban areas that are the places that house these large corporate campuses. So they built 1 housing unit for every 15 jobs. The big cities, which, there's a lot of media coverage of how difficult it is to build housing in San Francisco or Oakland, but we actually do a better job there. And then the inland regions, like your Stocktons and Sacramento's, built 1 housing unit for every 3 jobs. Let's see. So I want to go into some California history. Here is a home in 1950. The regional median income at that time is $6,600. And here is an ad for a home from Joseph Eichler, who is a mid-century modernist developer. He doesn't get into real estate development until his 40s. And he ends up staying in this Frank Lloyd Wright home, I think in Hillsborough, and he falls in love with it and the design and the aesthetic and everything. And he says, I really want to make this accessible to a lot of people. And so he becomes a developer that builds 11,000 homes throughout the state of California. And they are, simple, kind of spare. They're beautiful with lots of light. And, with kind of the veterans benefits that you have at a time, you can buy one for $9,400 with $300 down. So imagine if you could buy a home for 1.5 times your annual income. And the kind of cool, interesting thing is Steve Jobs, who's the CEO of Apple, ends up growing up in an Eichler competitor's home. And in the Walter Isaacson biography, he credits Eichler with kind of inspiring him to build well-designed, affordable products for the masses. And he says Eichler did a great thing. His houses were smart and cheap and good. They brought clean design and simple taste to lower-income people. But today, if you want to buy an Eichler, they've become luxury items. And there are books that you can buy about them, coffee table books. There are documentaries about them. And if you want to buy an Eichler in Palo Alto today, I think there's only one for sale, and it's $2.5 million. So at that time, California was a fast growth state. And this is a picture of Pat Brown, who was governor of California in the 60s. And that is his son, Jerry Brown, who is the current governor of California. He was both the youngest governor of California, and he's now the oldest governor of California. So Pat Brown oversaw a California that was in a different period. 500,000 people were moving to California a year. And so the state was rapidly building out highway infrastructure, transit infrastructure. It was building out schools. He oversaw the master plan for higher education, which created the plan that we have for the University of California system, which is one of the best public university systems in the world, and the CSUs and the community college systems. But by the time his son took over in the 70s, California was in a different state. A lot of things had changed, and we'd entered a new, different kind of mentality around slow growth and conservation. And so we stopped building housing en masse in the 60s, and then we kind of gradually declined over the next following several decades. So in the early 70s, a lot of growth controls came into existence. In 72, Petaluma set a rule that said you couldn't build more than 500 homes a year. The California State Supreme Court ruled that if a city downzoned your property, they didn't have to compensate you for the loss of financial value. A lot of cities adopted and enshrined single-family zoning, like Palo Alto, And we also had the California Environmental Quality Act, which did some good, but also made it really easy to file lawsuits to stall private development. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I mean, we had an oil crisis, there were gas lines, people began thinking, like very rightfully so, about the impacts of growth on our environment. And there were also other impacts, like in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed a week after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and it banned explicit racial discrimination. So, if you couldn't explicitly blockbust, or if you couldn't explicitly have racial covenants, I mean, zoning is another arguably tacit or implicit way to control the economic or class or racial makeup of your community. So California in the 70s, our housing prices started deviating from the rest of the country. And in the 70s, a lot of the headlines were quite similar to what we have today. People's homes were going up by 2 or 3x in a decade, and the concern was that people's taxes were also going up with the price of their homes. So, the story of the time was that the elderly people were going to be taxed out of their homes. And so in 1978, we passed a law, and I'm going to talk a little bit in depth about this because I think this is a pretty significant difference between California and Washington. Our tax systems are very different. We have capped property taxes, and then we have the most progressive income taxes in the country. And this isn't an argument about like more or less, it's just to provoke a set of thoughts about, you have to be really thoughtful about how you design incentives through your tax system, because it can motivate or demotivate certain types of behavior. So after Prop 13, we cap property taxes, and so your tax, what you pay in property tax in your home is tied to what you paid for it. So you can enter a neighborhood, and some people are paying taxes according to when they bought their home in 1982, and some people are paying taxes in their home based on when they bought it in 2015. And so those are very different assessment rates. And also, we have a supermajority vote required for new taxes and major bonds. So I think there's also a very interesting backstory to this. There's a court case called Serrano versus Priest, which was a precursor to this. In the 60s, there was an East Los Angeles social worker named John Serrano who wanted to send his kid to a good public school. And when he was asking about why the schools in his neighborhood were so poorly funded and resourced, he was told, "I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. You just have to move somewhere else." And he did end up moving somewhere else, but later on, he ended up lending his name to a suit where he sued the state of California over this particular system. And over a series of 3 rulings, he actually won. And the state of our Supreme Court ruled that this was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And so we then had to equalize our school spending throughout the state. And so there was this guy, Howard Jarvis, who was a newspaper publisher, had tried to run a previous initiative that was similar to this one in 72, and it failed. But when the Equalization Act went into effect in 78, he won. And so there's this friend of mine who is writing a book about Antioch and Brentwood, which are exurban regions that are generally lower income in the Bay Area. He said, if you can't codify discrimination in housing, then you can undermine the fiscal foundation upon which a more equal and less segregated California would have been built. So people, knowing that their property taxes weren't going to go to their local schools, they said, well, we're gonna cut all the taxes that go to our public systems in general. So it completely alters our state and municipal finance. And so property taxes, at least initially, drop substantially right after it's passed. And what it does, it has this effect on land parcels and land development. So, if you have a parcel of land, even if you've done nothing to it and you've owned it for 30 or 40 years and you're paying taxes on it based on what you paid for it 30 or 40 years ago, there's no strong incentive or disincentive on how you use it. So what happens is there's very limited developable parcels left in the Bay Area. And so if you don't get the price that you want, people just withhold it and they wait until the next cycle when it might double or triple in value. And so here's a lot in the Richmond, which is in the west side of San Francisco, simple lot, it's $1 million, can be zoned for 2 units. So if you have expensive land, you're gonna have expensive housing produced at the end. Here's another parcel, it's in the Mission, and this is a laundry. This owner, he said, I would love to sell it for affordable housing. which sounds great, and is, if we could get it for a reasonable price, that would be great, but he's holding out for $250,000 a unit, which is what the city paid for a parcel that was nearby on South Van Ness. And then if you also decrease property taxes, it's kind of like interest rates. When you raise interest rates, that affects housing values. If you decrease interest rates, that juices housing values. After we passed it, when we cut property taxes in the early 80s in Northern California, every dollar decrease in property taxes led to an increase in property values by $7. And so you can see this kind of relationship here. Detroit has a very different property tax system than we do. Like, you might think that you're getting a really inexpensive house, but it might come with a really expensive assessment. Whereas in San Francisco or California, you can have houses that were bought 30, 40 years ago, and they're assessed from a long, long time ago. And most of the benefits happen to accrue to wealthier households. This is a legislative analyst's office study of Prop 13, and most of the benefits went to households making more than $120,000 a year. And it's the wealthiest communities in California that have the lowest effective property tax rates. So you'll have homes in Palo Alto where there's a median price of $2.6 million, but their tax rate is 0.4%. And so it kind of, incentivizes people to hold on for a long time. And then you can also pass it down to your kids. So, this is a very interesting dynamic that's starting to happen now. If you have a house that you bought in the 70s and 80s, people are passing that down to their kids with the old tax rate. And so that's like a very common dynamic that people are starting to see. It costs San Francisco maybe close to $100 million a year, Los Angeles close to $250 million a year. Hold on. And it also inhibits turnover. So even 15 years ago, maybe 10% of houses would turn over a year, and now it's more like 5%. And that has a real impact on inventory. So even if we try to build, even as we're trying to build, the number of houses that go for sale in a city in a given year are actually falling, and they're half of what they were a decade ago. So in San Francisco, maybe 600 to 7,600 homes or condos go for sale a year. In Palo Alto, which is the birthplace of Silicon Valley, maybe 500 are up for sale a year. In Cupertino, which is where Apple's based, and they're an $800 billion company, there's maybe 30 houses for sale at a time. So it's really constrained. And then at the same time, every cycle, property values basically have doubled every upcycle since the early 80s. And then there's generational inequity in this. In the 60s, maybe half of 25 to 35-year-olds owned homes. Today it's more like close to a quarter. Today, if you want to buy a home, you need to be able to pull a $7,400 a month mortgage in San Mateo, $7,300 in San Francisco for the median home, $5,900 in Santa Clara County, $4,400 in Alameda. And then people who are born in 1990 are generally paying 50% or more of their income on housing today. And then also, this is maybe 40%, close to 40% of Californians 18 to 34 live at home. And then on top of that, so there's this dynamic, you have gentrification in the cities, but the suburbs are also rapidly aging out. So in Palo Alto was the birthplace of Silicon Valley. In 1970, the median age was 30. Today, more than a third of homeowners are over the age of 65. So it's just, there's not really family housing that's available for the next generation of families. And then, of course, there's racial inequity and displacement. This is a map of the Urban Displacement Project. The purple areas are where you're seeing displacement of lower-income communities, and the orange areas are generally exclusionary areas that people can't get into because they're basically zoned out. And I think the thing that's really upsetting about this map from a historical perspective, it's basically the same map as redlining maps from the 1930s. So, if you look at old redlining maps, West Oakland and the east side of San Francisco are redlined areas. And so you have these areas that were historically left out of the wealth formation of homeownership. And then that led to the different property value differentials that existed and wealth differentials that existed over many decades. And then now, in this generation, this population growth is going in and displacing a lot of those communities. And what that's leading to is mega commuting. This is a story that was in the New York Times maybe a month ago. This is a woman who's a city employee. She gets up at 2:15 in the morning and then takes a series of trains in and to get to work in San Francisco by 7 a.m. And this is disproportionately, again, happening to people of color and lower income people. It's also going down the chain into homelessness. Alameda County saw a 39% increase in homelessness from the last point in time count 2 years ago. San Francisco is mostly stable, actually, because we have lots of systems in place and we have lots of programs. But Alameda County in the East Bay is losing its last naturally affordable pockets of housing. And then it's also impacting our education system. So the top story is about a first grade class that had 13 different teachers over the course of a year. And then the bottom story is about a teacher who is homeless. So in San Francisco, the starting pay is something around, I want to say $48,000 a year. And then our rent, of course, is like, one bedroom rent is like $3,600. It's really impossible for teachers to find housing, and so that's impacting our public education system. So I want to get back into this tax issue because it's kind of important. So without property tax, California has come to rely on personal income tax. 70% of our general fund comes from personal income tax. And generally the wealth of Silicon Valley and the wealth of all the companies is not captured in corporate tax, it's captured in income tax. So the top 1% pays for half of the personal income tax revenue in the state. And like this year, that's something like $45 billion. And then 37% of personal income tax in general comes from the Bay Area. So even though we're less than we're about 17% of the state's population, we're almost 40% of the personal income tax revenue. So the state collects income tax, cities can't collect income tax. And it's generally progressive. We're obviously much more progressive than Washington. The primary issue with it is that it's volatile. And so our state is basically dependent on how the stock market performs. And when we go into a bad year, our total PIT revenue can decline by 20 or $30 billion, and then we have to like cut a bunch of stuff, and it's a really totally chaotic disaster. So it also impacts municipal finance, and this is really important. A couple weeks ago, San Jose said it was interested in bidding for the second Amazon headquarters. And San Jose has a median home price of close to $1 million. And so all of us were like, oh my God, why would you do this? We can't handle this right now. And they're also in negotiation with Google to build office space for 20,000 jobs. And then the key thing is like, because of the way Prop 13 works, and because of the costs of providing services to residents, they earn a lot more money from employment lands. So if they approve office space, like the 15% of office space land, employment lands that San Jose has, adds $124 million to their budget, and the residential lands lose the city $110 million a year. So all the cities are very motivated to build more office space because you can capture the local tax revenue, but then you don't have to pay for all the people with police, fire, and schools. Here's another example. Here's Brisbane. They're a 684-acre parcel, like right below the San Francisco border. A developer wants to build 4,400 units. The city is like, I don't know, I don't want this. And the reason is, partially they don't want all the people, but the other reason is if they just did hotels and office, they would get $9 million more in net tax revenue. And if they built housing, they would only get $1 million more in net tax revenue. So it just kind of goes on down the line. This is Moraga. They have a $169,000 median income. They can't pay for basic services because of the way our tax structure works. And then the other significant difference in the Bay Area is we have rent control, and this does provide a level of stability to tenants. There's a big difference between rent-controlled tenants in San Francisco versus those who are not rent-controlled in the South Bay. In the South Bay, your landlord can increase your rent at any time, and then you're out. In San Francisco, we have some of the strongest rent control laws in the country. And it creates a lot of other interesting dynamics in the housing market that I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But in San Francisco, only 9% of our housing stock is actually market rate rental. About half of the whole housing stock is rent controlled. So when you see the crazy sticker prices, that's not really always what people are paying. Like if you know a lot of people, you can usually find a room. You won't be the master tenant, but you can find a room. And then we also have another detail is it's modern rent control, so it doesn't apply to buildings built after 1979 in San Francisco, so it doesn't really, in the development conversation, it doesn't really come up as a disincentive for development because it doesn't apply to new buildings. And we passed a few affordable housing bonds, less than you guys as a city, and then Alameda County and Santa Clara County did some too. Overall, state funding is down enormously. We're down 2/3 from the last recession, and that's because of our crazy volatile budget structure. And then building housing in general, BMR and below market rate and subsidized housing is really, really expensive. This is the Legislative Analyst's Office. They said if we're going to build BMR housing for all 1.7 million rent burden low-income households in the state, it would cost in excess of $250 billion, and that's 5 times what we spend on K-12 education. In San Francisco, this is what it currently costs in 2017 to build a new market rate unit. It's just above $700,000, which is like you can't even do it without, like you couldn't even make a unit accessible to a moderate or a low-income housing household without a significant public subsidy of some sort. It's just not, the math doesn't work out. Our land costs are too high, our labor costs are too high. And so we have inclusionary housing ordinance. Today it's like 18% for rentals and 20% for condominiums. And we created 4,600 permanently affordable units since 2002. We used to have a 12 or 20% rate. We increased it over the last year. Our planning director did say in July that it is the combination of that plus construction costs is impacting our pipeline now. It's a combination of them both. So you can definitely get some of the way there, and you can have a meaningful impact with inclusionary. But if you want to have more impact beyond that, you need to find other permanent funding mechanisms. And so I want to end with some good news. We passed the largest housing package in probably modern Californian history last Friday. We got, I think it's like several important bills. I think I keep seeing the numbers changing. Last week somebody said it was 7, now somebody said it was 15. But here's the bigger pieces. We got a $3 billion affordable housing bond that's going to be on the 2018 ballot. We got an immediate source of affordable housing funding today through a $75 real estate transaction fee, and this was the one that the whole housing package hinged on. And then we also got a streamlining bill done for communities that don't match what their housing production requirements are at the state level, get expedited permitting for projects that match the existing zoning. So we're making, it's a really deep hole, but we're getting there slowly, very slowly. Thank you.
Let's get another big round of applause for Daniel and Kim, and we're going to wrong way. What we're going to do is move our chairs up to the front so we can interact better with the audience. We're going to bring the house lights up, I think. We're going to scribble our questions if we haven't already and pass them to the aisles, and we will engage in conversation. I will start us off with a question for each of the panelists. Something that surprised you in the other panel, in your counterparts' presentation. So what surprised you that you learned about Chicago? What surprised you that you learned about San Francisco?
That's really, I guess, sorry. I'll just hold this. I had actually heard of the Prop 13 sort of parent to child sort of transfer of sort of lower tax rates, but that always blows my mind every time I see it, and certainly seeing the sort of the numbers on it, to create that kind of sort of hereditary. I sort of wonder if aristocracy is too strong of a word, right? But this hereditary group of people who control such amount of wealth at such a discount is really pretty shocking to me.
I'm trying to think. I think that, I didn't think it was it wasn't surprising, but the part about how the largest housing burdens are in the lowest income areas of Chicago, that's still always stunning to me as well.
How does the Chicago and Illinois tax system impact the housing system there?
That's a good question. It's certainly not nearly as big of a player as in California. And Chicago. I think the biggest area where you see it now is in effect, in gentrifying areas that are sort of being added to the sort of wealthy core, older homeowners, who are on fixed income or on sort of working class incomes, are seeing, although their sort of wealth is increasing as the value of their home increases, they don't have that in terms of cash flow, right? And so they don't have it to pay the sort of growing tax assessment on their properties. And I think that's, at the moment, I think that's the sort of the biggest tax issue as it relates to housing.
Abolish zoning, yes or no?
I don't really believe in just taking off,
So no.
we live in earthquake-prone areas. We need to think about sea level rise. We need to be thoughtful about environmental consequences and safety and those kinds of larger community design issues.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah. I would also say...
Does that mean yes, or does that mean... We should give them signs, yes or no?
All right, I guess I'll say no then. I think beyond that, beyond sort of the yes, no, the exclusionary policies, as Kim went into in great detail, right, in terms of all this sort of tax issues and lots of other issues, these sort of exclusionary land use problems and problematic land use policies go way beyond zoning. And so in some ways, like asking abolish zoning, yes, no, is like too small of a question. You want a sort of more holistic look at what is causing what is causing inequitable outcomes, and in many cases, zoning is a huge part of that, but it's certainly not the whole issue.
Kim, do you see a path to unwind California's dysfunctional taxation system?
Okay, so there was I think it's our controller ran a comprehensive study of it last year, and there was a whole bipartisan committee that looked at different options. It didn't really talk too much about Prop 13 in particular, because that would take a 2/3 vote to unwind, but it did talk about, well, if retail is really strongly affected by, say, online sales, and then you're gonna look at significant reductions in sales tax revenue to municipalities, like maybe you would look at going more towards a services tax or a VAT tax or something like that. So those were some of the options that were discussed in that scenario. And then we also have, it wasn't our controller, I don't remember, it was Betty Yee who led that study. And then we do have a candidate named John Chung who was our controller, who is, running on some tax reform, a bit of a tax reform platform. Mm-hmm. So, I know that Gavin Newsom has talked loosely about it as well.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the strength of the YIMBY movement in each of your cities.
I think so. There are several chapters all around the Bay Area. In the East Bay Peninsula, and San Francisco is probably the strongest. We'd be looking at trying to help form one in Marin, or the northern part of the Bay would be great too. But in general, this is just, it's more of a grassroots volunteer-led movement around just building more housing, any type of housing in general. One of the cool things that particular movement got passed in the last week, there was a suit that they filed against at first Lafayette and then Berkeley, and then they drafted a stronger legal version of that bill that passed, that a state senator, Nancy Skinner, got passed, that makes it harder to reject housing that matches the existing plans and zoning codes without more of an explicit rationale from the municipality.
Yeah, and in Chicago, there's a small YIMBY movement. I think, as I sort of said, one of the big differences with Chicago is there really isn't a regional housing shortage in the way that there is in the Bay Area or in Seattle. It's really pretty, it's localized in particular neighborhoods that are suddenly seeing this giant uptick in demand. But there's sort of an interesting thing that's happened in the last few months, which is, so for the most part, the sort of debates over new housing in the neighborhoods have focused on these sort of mid-rise, very high-end apartments in gentrifying neighborhoods, and so there has been a lot of sort of both from sort of classic sort of conservative anti-development forces, but also from people who are genuinely concerned about affordability, who are who feel like these buildings are worsening that and are sort of adopting anti-density, anti-development messaging. And then more recently in this year, sort of just up the Blue Line, for those of you who know Chicago, the Blue Line has been sort of, goes on the northwest side of the city to O'Hare. It's been sort of the epicenter of gentrification debates for the last several years. Just up the Blue Line in a more middle class, stable neighborhood, there is a proposal for a large mid-rise, low-income housing project. And it brought out a lot of the sort of classic sort of 1960s style fear-mongering and race baiting, but also much of it sort of cloaked in this language of density and parking and all this other stuff, sort of thin veil over what's really an anti-affordable housing protest. And so it's been interesting to sort of have the tables turned in that way, where I think there's sort of more consciousness because of this particular fight about the ways that sort of anti-density language is used as a kind of exclusionary tool in Chicago.
Mm. In Seattle, only 2% of single-family homes have accessory dwelling units and detached accessory dwelling units, in other words, in-law apartments and backyard cottages. These units have been identified as key tools for missing middle and housing for aging in place. How are your cities using accessory units to increase density?
So California passed a bill last year called SB 1069, which eases certain requirements, I think around like water and electrical hookups, I want to say. I'm not super, I don't know the super specifics of the bill, but at a state-wide level, it made it a lot easier to build ADUs across all of California. And then there's a number of companies that are kind of moving in that space to make it easy for people to build. I think some of the issues that I think remain there are like, a financing pool would probably be pretty helpful for a lot of homeowners that are cash constrained if they wanted to build one, because you effectively to build one, you can, put close to $200,000 to build one, or you have to take out like a HELOC, which I think adds, maybe $1,000 a month to your monthly payment, which I think for a lot of cash constrained owners, that would be probably pretty problematic. Mm. So I think like a community financing pool would probably be really helpful for that.
Do you know, Kim, how the property tax assessment would work on a new
I
backyard
don't
cottage?
think it triggers a new reassessment, is my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's not like a wholesale reassessment, but I think there would be a small amount added through, I think, the HELOC. This is the way it's been explained to me before, mm-hmm. but.
Yeah, and I mean, in Chicago, it's funny, in a lot of the older neighborhoods, accessory dwelling units, sort of old, ones that were built in the original wave of development in, the 1880s through the 1920s are quite common. And they do provide, I know lots of people who, when they were first out of college and they were looking for a place to live, they do provide a sort of lower cost housing stock in these dense core neighborhoods. But construction of new ADUs is basically non-existent, and there really doesn't appear to be any movement to change that. It has not been a big focus of sort of efforts to make housing more affordable in the city.
Are they not built because they're illegal or because there's no market?
I believe because they're illegal. There's no. I mean, one of the other things about Chicago is in a lot of these neighborhoods, 2 and 3 unit buildings sort of stacked on top of each other are, in some places, are legal and are sort of more common. So I think that is. I guess, almost thought of as a substitute for that. But no, it is not. You can't have a situation where you have a single-family home and then you build another in the back. That just doesn't.
Yesterday we talked a little bit about what's involved in getting permission to add housing to an existing neighborhood in your respective cities. Tell me about a prototypical case. What's required in Chicago if you want to build more housing?
You need the approval of the alderman, period. That's really it. Chicago has 50 aldermen. Each one of them is essentially the dictator of their small town. And every change has to go through them. And so because of this, many of them sort of preemptively downzone areas that they suspect will be subjects of development interest. They downzone below what they ultimately want the final development to be. Sometimes they do this, sort of prospectively years in advance, and there's no particular interest, but they're saying, oh, that's probably going to happen. And sometimes it's very it's very tightly linked to a particular situation. And sometimes I think the main interest for that is twofold. One, it allows them to go through a series of public meetings where the developer has to ask for permission for upzoning and present to the community, and sometimes that can be good, although it also certainly leads to opportunities for sort of pressuring to not add any new housing. But also it creates sort of an incentive for the developer to scratch the alderman's back because there's this one person that they have to get. So yeah.
So how much influence do neighbors in the alderman's districts have? Is the alderman listening to the residents mostly, or?
Yeah, it really depends alderman to alderman. I mean, aldermanic elections in Chicago are not generally super competitive, although they're becoming more so. But it's really idiosyncratic, and it goes beyond even just the absolute zoning. So, for example, there are these two aldermen who have different sections of Milwaukee Avenue and Logan Square, which is this sort of the backbone of the gentrifying Northwest Side. And Chicago has an inclusionary zoning law. It says you have to set aside 10% of your units as low-income housing, but you can buy out of it. Up until recently, you could buy out of it for $100,000 a unit, which, financially speaking, always makes sense for the developer to do, and so they almost always do it. However, in Logan Square, one of the aldermen has an official policy, which I think probably would not stand up to a legal challenge, but has this policy that you have to build the units on site. He will not approve your upzone, and you do absolutely need an upzone because he will downzone before you can build on what's already there. He will not approve your upzone unless you do the 10% units on site, and so they do. A few blocks away, in a different alderman's ward, same developer, same market, same product, basically. We're talking, 6-7-story mid-rise rentals. Nothing on site because that alderman doesn't ask, and so it really is that level of sort of, it just depends on the alderman.
Is it at least a fast process of bribery, or?
Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's very fast. Again, it's sort of. I mean, I think you get a sense of the number of meetings and the number of months that it takes depends on how much trouble the alderman thinks this particular development is going to cause. It can be, or it can stretch on. And in extreme cases, so I mentioned the low-income, affordable mid-rise development, and the middle-class neighborhood, Jefferson Park. In that case, neighbors have really, really gone on the offensive, have launched lawsuits have launched, all sorts of like pulling out the stops to gum up the works, and in that case they've been fairly successful. It's dragged on for much longer than is normal, but that's a more the exception than the rule. Or I mean there's another example I can think of in Lincoln Park, which is one of the very central neighborhoods. It's actually losing population. There was a huge hospital that was shut down. They moved downtown. Huge parcel, basically an entire block, one block from the Red Line, L line, and because of lawsuits, because of various things, that took 2 years for them to redevelop that site as housing. And it's just starting construction now.
How does 2 years sound to you, Kim?
It's pretty short.
Let's hear about the San Francisco.
I mean, California's system is a little bit different. I mean, it's very different from Chicago's in the sense that it's not one person that you have to please. Anybody can file an appeal against you, so you have to really try and please as many people as possible. And so, I mean, like it's very, it's typical for a building in one community. They, need to pay off donations to like this many nonprofits and organizations. It also varies pretty substantially by municipality. Like, again, we have really, really fragmented governance. We have 101 cities and 9 counties in the Bay Area, and it can vary a lot. So, like the East Bay in general has been more amenable to development because it wants more city revenue to support the budget that it has, and then the western half of the Bay is much more affluent and doesn't really care. So, like if you go down to, Palo Alto or Cupertino, it's like, went to a meeting where I was from, and there were 3 projects on the table, and then they approved the 2 hotels, but not the housing, and like people went up and they were like, well, we don't want housing because then it brings kids, and kids will be in our schools, and and it just takes a lot. I mean, it takes a lot. It can take many, like there's a failed mall near where I grew up that has been failing for 30 years. It's like a 50-acre parcel right across the highway from Apple headquarters. And it's, it could just never compete with the adjacent malls down in San Jose and Palo Alto. And then finally, a single developer, all the retailers on it were failing enough at the same time that they all decided to sell at the same time. So one developer got all the parcels. And I'm not saying like I would have approved of the proposal that they brought forward, because I think they were being conservative. 10 years before, another developer had tried to put condos on it, and that was killed by ballot initiative. And so they came forward with this crazy like Starchitect design, $3 billion green roof campus with like 8,000 jobs worth of office space and 800 housing units. And then, a NIMBY group ran a ballot initiative against it, but except they wrote the ballot initiative wrong, and instead it accidentally upzoned the city instead of downzoned the city. And then, and then the developer also ran its own ballot initiative, and then both lost. So it's still a failed mall. It's been a long time.
Kim mentioned generational equity. What signs are you seeing that young people are mobilizing political power to take on, for example, single-family zoning or undo Proposition 13?
Oh, sorry, are you talking to me or yes?
Both of you.
Yeah, okay. You can go first.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I guess the short answer is not a ton. The generational side, again, because we don't have anything like Prop 13, I think one thing that has started to happen only recently in the last 10 years, 15 years, and that I think people are only recently sort of realizing is happening is sort of this. And it's related again to these neighborhoods that are losing population because of the sort of high-end single-family conversions. That neighborhoods, that had been sort of originally gentrified with these sort of young professionals, are increasingly, it's not a 30 or 35-year-old making, $80,000 or $90,000 a year. It's a 45 or 55-year-old couple making $200,000 or $300,000 a year. And so, the sort of earlier waves of gentrifiers are being displaced. And so I think there is some sort of growing awareness about that dynamic, but it really has not translated, I don't think, into any sort of policy at the moment.
Well, I definitely think we have to honor our obligations to, public sector workers that have worked for us. I definitely think that we should respect people who want to stay and age in place. A lot of times I bring up this issue because I don't think my generation really understands the whole depth of how far it goes through the educational system, and then the housing situation, and then what we're going to be able to spend on services going forward. When in the 1960s, California had some of the was in the top 5 for per capita spending on students. But by the time that I was in school in the 80s, even then, I remember our PE teachers and art teachers asking us to go around as 5-year-olds, fundraising. And then today, if you look, you see these, in the absence of having reliable or stable funding for a lot of public schools, the wealthy districts do these crazy, massive, multi-million-dollar fundraisers outside of that while they augment the basic sort of state funding. And then at the state level, I remember being a student journalist and then going and covering University of California Regents meetings and hearing Dianne Feinstein's husband talk about paying $58 a quarter or whatever it was to go to Berkeley, and then being in the midst of constant just excruciating conversations about students really being unable to afford all of the tuition hikes and increases that literally happen every economic cycle that we have. And today, I didn't mention this anecdote in the story, but I remember reading historical stories about Silicon Valley. Tom Wolfe, who's author of Bonfire of the Vanities and the electric acid test, he wrote an early 80s article about Robert Noyce, the founder of Intel. And he describes the story of how Robert Noyce moved to the Bay Area to work for William Shockley, who turned out to be a total jerk. And he showed up in Palo Alto in the morning at 6 a.m. And by midday he had a contract to buy a house in Mountain View. And today, it is this extremely rare thing to do. You have to be really wealthy, or you have to win a BMR lottery, or you have to, have some other in. And then another level, which is we don't have a reliable or stable funding situation for a lot of municipalities in California. So in San Francisco, we're about to have a $10 billion budget for the city and county of San Francisco. But every department, including the Department of Homelessness, has been asked to cut 3% year over year, even though we're seeing these increases in revenue, because we have so many back obligations and pension obligations to pay off. And because our pension funds are not returning what they are supposed to be returning, because we have really low interest rates, in part, we have these enormous liabilities that we need to fund, and the way that we're going to do that is we're going to cut services, and we're going to cut the quality of our schools, and we're going to cut the quality of all of these future services to present and future Californians. And that, I think, in aggregate is pretty frustrating. So.
Okay, with real wages decreasing as corporations force a race to the bottom of wages, how can new construction, as a solution to cruel musical chairs, provide, quote, affordable housing, unquote? Don't we need massive public housing?
Yeah. I think this is a sort of both and situation. In places where, you have this musical chair situation where you have these bidding wars, and I think, downtown Chicago is sort of one of these examples. You can sort of stop. You can stop those bidding wars from affecting more people by allowing the sort of people who are sort of flowing into the market to be absorbed in these new buildings, right? The 40,000 households who were absorbed in downtown construction in the 2000s are people who are not buying 3 flats in Lincoln Park and deconverting them to single-family homes. On the other hand, that was sort of one of the purposes of showing that last slide that I did about sort of the greatest housing burdens being in the lowest housing cost neighborhoods. That there are a significant number of people, especially in Chicago has a lot of high-income people. It also, is in many ways a Rust Belt city. It has a lot of low-income people. And at those incomes, even the cost of, maintaining a home, let alone, building from scratch is not attainable. And for that low income bracket, we do need a lot more housing support for them.
You want to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, I would say that we do have a lot of government housing, government subsidized housing in America. It's just being targeted inappropriately. The mortgage interest deduction is probably like the fourth or fifth largest tax subsidy in this country, and it primarily goes to upper income households. And as I said, in the state of California, we have Prop 13, and the benefits of that also go to upper income households. And so, if you were able to, reconsider and rechannel some of that and target it, at more needy households, I think that would go a long way towards making housing more accessible and affordable to Americans.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on that, when I was with City Observatory, we wrote a piece basically showing that just the amount of the mortgage interest tax deduction going to households making over $100,000 a year would be enough to basically give a housing voucher through Section 8 to every household that currently qualifies for them. Right now, we give them to about a quarter, simply because the money isn't there. But as Kim said, the money is there in the form of housing subsidies. It's just going overwhelmingly to upper income households.
Yeah. Seattle's far left politicians often side with NIMBY policies. Is this pattern prevalent in San Francisco and or Chicago?
This is all a bearing of politics. That's what it is. I mean, so yes. That's kind of a defining attribute. I mean, I think there was one egregious case, there was a couple months ago, someone, a well-known housing advocacy group that, was linked with a lot of, the downzonings in the 70s and 80s. Like, they wanted to have a historical review of a parking garage in that, that it was historically significant.
What about Chicago?
It's definitely not quite like San Francisco and Chicago. I think it's still developing. The sort of people's because this is a much newer issue in Chicago. People haven't really talked about a housing crisis in the same way before the last, decade or so. And so you certainly do see some sort of left anti-development rhetoric. Like I said, it's been more complicated as sort of people have realized that same rhetoric is also used against 100% low-income housing, and I think as people have started to pay more attention to places like Lincoln Park, where there is actually de-densification going on, and that's associated with the most expensive, most exclusionary housing in the region. So it's a mix. I would say it is not settled yet in Chicago.
A quick note to folks who submitted questions. There are a number that I'm not asking because they're very specific questions about Seattle, and I don't think it's fair to ask our guests to be experts on policy questions that are kind of inside baseball for Seattle. So I'm focusing on questions that are where their lessons from Chicago and San Francisco can help us. So if your question has not been asked, that may be the reason. So with race as an example, are your cities doing anything to ensure equitable access to new and or affordable development?
We had a supervisor named Lyndon Breed who grew up in public housing, who, during the prior administration, she was trying to get a rule passed so that people who lived in the neighborhood where the affordable housing development was built would have priority access to it in a lottery. And I think originally HUD ruled against it because, under a fair housing rationale. But then she went to DC in order to argue that this was actually, that was not this is not reflective of the current situation of San Francisco and the Bay Area right now, and we needed something that was a little bit more targeted to handle displacement.
Yeah, I mean, in Chicago, this is a huge issue historically. The Chicago Housing Authority, I believe up until very, very recently, was still under a 1970s court order that found that they had been intentionally using public housing placement and policies to segregate the city. And you know, as we've sort of gone through our public housing redevelopment programs with Hope 6, you know, the question of desegregation has been really prominent. I mean, unfortunately, despite the fact that it has been at the center of a lot of conversations, you know, I'm sort of I'm at a loss to think of any sort of really concrete policies that people have taken to actually promote desegregation in the city. And I mean, you know, to be perfectly frank, I think that reflects the fact that people are still really ambivalent about it. There's still a lot of discrimination, and there's still a lot of, you know, there are a lot of people who are comfortable with how segregated Chicago is.
So San Francisco has what you called modern rent control. Chicago?
Chicago does not have rent control. It is prohibited by the state of Illinois.
And Washington state law also bans rent control, though there are groups who would like to change that. What are your thoughts, both of you, about Seattle and rent control?
Well, I mean, I think in the state of California, I mean, if we already effectively give property owners something, it's like rent. Prop 13 is kind of like rent control, but for your taxes. So if you're offering, you know, homeowners a benefit like that, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't seem fair, equitable to, you know, subject tenants to the full kind of unpredictability and force of, you know, the current situation. Mm-hmm. Which is I mean, and I think the impact on Barrie politics is a little bit complex. So, like, as I said in the thing, like, it doesn't apply to new housing. So it's not it's not a thing that comes up with developers. It's not a disincentive for them to build because their units are not going to be rent controlled. What I would say is, like, you know, because homeowners and tenants have these different protections that exist for them, they often end up working together as the political bloc that you described earlier because they're more concerned with, you know, maintaining their neighborhood or maintaining their, you know, their protections, and more focused on that than recognizing that, like, you know, our region and our state is growing in population, and, you know, like 80% of California's net population growth is just children of Californians generally. And so if we don't plan for that, you know, we are going to end up seeing a worse situation than we have. So, you know, it just sort of changes incentives in, you know, a pretty subtle but important way. But it's not like a direct disincentive to building more housing. And then it also creates a lot of other complexities, like in terms of, in California we have something called vacancy. It's vacancy decontrol, right? So when this was passed through a law that was pushed forward by the real estate industry in 1996 called the Costa-Hawkins Law. So if you know, tenant is evicted or they leave willingly or whatever, you know, the rental unit gets reset at the market price. And what this does to the landlord-tenant dynamic is very difficult, because over time, as the tenant's rent is, you know, farther and farther, is more and more different from the current market rate rent, the landlord becomes more and more financially incentivized to evict them. And so that creates a situation where we can give people protection and tenants a lot of stability and protection for a long time. You know, we have some of the strongest rent control laws in the country. But if they get evicted through, say, an owner move-in eviction, which is very hard to contest, there's very little that the city can do for them at that point, like, if anything. And so that's a really devastating situation in many cases.
Mm-hmm. Dan, do you have anything to add on rent control?
Not a lot. I mean, you know, because Chicago doesn't actually have rent control, it's sort of, you know, it's such a sort of hypothetical without details, and it seems like, you know, with rent control, the details really, really, really matter. That, yeah, I don't know that I have any
great,
super insightful things to say.
So last question: we have been looking for lessons from your cities, from Seattle. Are there some lessons that you are drawing from Seattle for your cities?
I mean, you know, walking around a lot of the neighborhoods, I'm impressed by how normal mid-rises are, at least on major corridors. You know, in Chicago, there's this, you know, Chicago is an old, pretty dense city, but even in the in the pre-war development, apart from a few areas along the lake, there's a pretty serious sort of 4-floor ceiling to these walk-up buildings, and I think that is sort of that sort of path dependency is carried on, and people look really askance at 5-story buildings. I mean, it sounds funny to say, but it's like what what are you gonna do? Even if, for various reasons of, lot coverage and parking requirements and unit sizes, they're actually less dense than many of the older 4-story or even 3-story buildings. There's something about that freaks people out, and that seems like that's not the case here.
From what I've been reading, you passed a really, really significant transit proposal. Was it like the Sound Transit? It was like more than $50 billion. We in the Bay Area, we desperately need to do that pretty soon. We have one Transbay tube. It's survived one earthquake. I don't really know about the next one, but we should probably get like redundancy there. And we also have, we have like 20 plus different transit agencies in the Bay Area because we're so fragmented. So, the last bond that we were able to pass was basically just a maintenance bond. It was like $3.5 billion to cover just keeping things running. But I like the, kind of newfound ambition to think big about transit.
Great. Well, that's a good place for us to end for the evening. Let's give some big Seattle love to Daniel and Kim-Mai with huge thanks.